Hey everyone! So real quick before we get into today's video, I just wanted to give you all a heads up. So for the first 50 minutes of today's video, my mic was not plugged in all the way. Did not do that final click. So I do sound like I'm pretty far away. I think it's still usable, I just wanted to give you guys a heads up. Yeah, so sorry about that. I knew that was going to happen one day, right? Secondly, I do say this in the intro, but I just want to reiterate, today's case is so unknown and was such a small time case that there are hardly any photos in today's case. I couldn't even find a photo of one of the victims. So yeah, just wanted to give y'all a heads up. And finally, I'm sure you can tell, this is hands down the longest video I have ever done. I don't know how that happened because I swear it did not feel that long when I was recording it, but I did want to know, what would you guys prefer? Should I have broken this up into 2 parts? Does that work better, you think? Or is just one big video enough? I don't know, I'm still playing with my format and stuff, so I would love to know what you guys would prefer, what you think is better. I would love to get your thoughts. And also, I do, my disclaimer, one thing I did forget to add, as I do in a lot of my videos, we are also doing graphic descriptions of crime scenes as well. So just, be forewarned about that. I think that was everything that I just needed to give you guys a heads up about. And now let's go ahead and get into the video. Well, hey, how are you? Thank you so much for choosing to spend some time with me today. Welcome to what I call Crime Dive. My name is Crystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, at all, you find yourself drawn to true crime cases. So yeah, that's what I talk about. If you like true crime and you want to feel better about your makeup skills, you should absolutely subscribe, and come hang out with me every Tuesday, where I take a deep dive look into a true crime case while slapping on the old face. Man, my skin is looking really bad. Ugh. That's how you can tell that summer is almost here, is my skin just totally looks oily and terrible and broken out. Anyway, I hope you all are ready for today's case. It's another long one. Yes, last week we had the McStay family. Today we have a lesser known case, all right? And much like with the bunker murders that I did, what was it, a couple weeks ago? This case in particular hits very differently for me because this case took place in a town where I lived for about 6 to 7 years, and this case took place in that town. I was not living there at the time of the events of today's case, but I came across it and was just very floored and wanted to talk about it with y'all. Today, we will be talking about the case of Rosie Ortega and Mandy Scott. And today, I will be going into a very deep dive into who Rosie and Mandy were and their lives, who they were as people. And of course, we will also get into the perpetrator of today's crime. Disclaimer-wise, we are talking about a lot of heavy subject material today, guys. There's a lot of sexual assault. The perpetrator of today's case, the murderer, is a woman hater, very misogynistic, so there will be some pretty awful language used, so just, be forewarned. Also, today's case will not have a whole lot of visual accompaniment, all right? There's just not a lot of photos because this case was just not a big case. It's not very well known. I stumbled upon a book that was written about this case, and that is why I have so much detailed information about it. And I read about it, and again, this happened in a town where I lived for, quite a few years, and it just really, hit differently for me, and yeah, we'll get all into that, all right? So yeah, without further ado, sit back, relax, because we've got another long one. And let's get into the case of Rosie Ortega and Mandy Scott, all right? So we're going to start with Mandy first, all right? So Amanda Lee Mandy Scott was born on August 4th, 1975 to Debbie McMasters and Maxie Leon Scott. Mandy had an older half-sister named Crescinda, nicknamed Christy, and a younger brother named Jason. Now, Debbie, Mandy's mother, she was originally from Oakland, California, and Debbie had actually come from a very troubled and chaotic background herself. I won't go into too much detail about Debbie's history. We will be dipping a little bit into it because, Mandy was very young in this case. So a lot of her life is, of course, gonna revolve around her mother. But the book that I read for this case, which I will get into at the end of this case, really goes into a deep dive into the victim's family. And I mean deep dive. So yeah, Debbie was originally from Oakland, came from a pretty, chaotic, troubled background herself, and she had actually come down to Southern California because her brother, who was a Marine, was actually stationed at Camp Pendleton. And Debbie ended up living in Oceanside. Now, while in Oceanside, Debbie worked at the Playgirl Lounge as a dancer, and then she also worked at the local diner as a waitress. And it was at the diner where she met her first husband, who was a naval midshipman named Carl Fusler. The couple married and ended up having Mandy's older sister, Christy. By the way, while she was pregnant with Christy, Debbie did continue dancing at the playground. Why do I keep saying the Playground Lounge? The Playgirl Lounge until she was 7 months pregnant. And she, people wanted to see her dance. Yeah, so, you go, Debbie. Go for it. However, not long after Christy was born, the relationship between Debbie and Carl became abusive. He became physically abusive towards Debbie. He just became very irrationally angry and violent. He snapped and just got super irritated and angry at every little thing baby Christy did. Just, because some of those people, they can't really handle being around babies and kids and stuff. And it seemed like Carl was like that. And yeah, he ended up taking it out on Debbie. After 2 years, Debbie finally left Carl and took their daughter with him, and she went back to Oakland where her mother was living. And she ended up getting a job dancing at the NCO club. And this is where she would meet her second husband, Mandy's father, Maxie, who was in the Marines. And after only a couple of months after meeting, Debbie was pregnant with Mandy. And only 9 months after Mandy had been born, Debbie was pregnant with Jason. The family ended up relocating to San Diego, and after only a few days after Jason had been born, Maxie was called out to duty to Vietnam. Max had been called to Vietnam, and he was actually in charge of evacuating. He was evacuating fellow Americans, fellow soldiers, along with the Southern Vietnamese, and he wouldn't return until many months later. And it is said when he returned, he was different. It is said Max found it very difficult to bond with his son, little baby Jason. He was, I don't know if bitter is the right word, but, he had missed a good majority of the first year of his son's life, and he just couldn't bond with Jason, couldn't really, care for him as his own. After he got back, Max just became very bitter and angry. He was very bitter about the fallout of Vietnam. He had a very short temper. He seemed to be one of those guys, he was described as just sort of very thriving in the military, and he just was one of those guys who found it very difficult to adjust to civilian life. He began drinking heavily and then soon began physically abusing Debbie, who, by the way, wouldn't just sit around and take it. She would fight back every time. And any little thing would set Max off. Any little thing. It could be something as simple and trivial as his precious Cowboys losing a game, something as mundane as dinner being too hot or too cold or too late or something. And although each time Debbie would fight back, more often than not, it was Debbie who was left with, bruises and cuts and scrapes and stuff. Max even physically assaulted 4-year-old Christy one time for wetting her pants, to which Debbie, rightfully so, kicked him right in the nuts. Good for you, Debbie. Good for you. How dare you lay hands on a little child, how dare you lay your hands on anyone, but especially a child, Finally, after one particularly nasty fight, Max told Debbie that he was going to go back to Texas and marry his high school sweetheart, and that she had better be gone when he got home that night. Debbie attempted suicide by swallowing a bunch of pills, specifically muscle relaxers, but Max returned home and took her to the hospital. And in the 7 days that she was in the hospital, no one came and visited Debbie at all. And then when she was released and went back home, she discovered that Max had taken off, leaving the 3 children behind, 2 of which were his by blood, along with taking all the furniture and stuff. And Because Debbie had a pretty chaotic, rough background herself, she had some rough connections, and so some of her friends in the Hells Angels had actually come by to watch her kids while she was recovering in the hospital. Yeah, can you imagine? That's what she came out of the hospital to. Like, what a piece of human garbage. To sit there and abandon your kids like that. Like, Debbie then took her kids and left the area. And her and the kids, they sort of drifted and wandered for a while. They first stayed in a pretty poor area of San Diego before crashing in Motel 6s all throughout Northern California. At this time, Debbie was following a boyfriend, a biker boyfriend who was in prison nicknamed Monster, and he was getting transferred to different prisons throughout the northern part of the state, and so she was following him around. To make ends meet, Debbie collected welfare, tended bar, and was a small-time speed dealer. She also would smuggle meth into the prison when she would visit Monster. And finally, when she found out that Monster had been transferred yet again, Debbie finally had enough and had decided that, you know what, this is not the type of life that I want for my children. This isn't very good for them. Like, I just need to stop. I need to find some stability, and like, I just need to go somewhere with my kids that we can start fresh. And she was talking about this to one of the other motel's long-term residents. Apparently there were a small group of people who kind of made the Motel 6 in this one place in Northern California that she was at. They kind of made that hotel like kind of their home. And so she was talking to someone, you know, about this wanting to have a fresh start, to, you know, have some stability for her kids. And they suggested, hey, you should head down to Southern California into the desert and head to 29 Palms. And you can seek your fresh start there. Like, everything you need is over there. There's, you know, a bunch of people who actually seek a fresh start there. And yeah, you should see what it has to offer you. And so when she was 31 years old and Mandy was 7 years old, or excuse me, Mandy was 8 years old, Debbie took herself, Mandy, Jason, and Christy along with their new puppy that they had named Corky, and they headed to the Southern California desert to the small marine town of 29 Palms, where they were seeking a fresh start. Debbie ended up finding work on the large marine base in 29 Palms. She specifically worked at the E Club, which was an on-base hangout for the enlisted men, and she was a bartender. And over the next 2 years, Debbie and her family, they, you know, actually flourished there, you know? They were doing pretty all right. Debbie had a string of loyal, regular bar patrons who just loved her and always tipped really well. The kids had found new groups of friends and were actually flourishing in school and in their local community. And things were just, you know, really looking up for them for 2 years after they get to 29. However, like with many who end up, you know, who have kind of rough pasts, rough connections, you know, soon Debbie's past came a knocking. Don't you hate when one eye is just looking really good, but the other eye is not? It's very frustrating. So after living 2 years in the desert with her children and flourishing, some of Debbie's old friends and running mates contacted her. They sent word to her that they needed a favor that included running methamphetamine. So Debbie's friends, they had actually made a deal with an indigenous man named Russell. Russell was a member of the Louisiano tribe. I hope I just did not butcher the pronunciation of that. I'm sure that sounded super white. And Russell lived on the Rincon Reservation, which was outside of San Diego. Now, Russell here, he happened to be a cooker of methamphetamine. And because he was on a reservation, it was more difficult for the feds to monitor drug activity, all right? And so this reservation had become sort of a safe haven, you know, for cookers of meth and drug dealers and, you know, other types like that. Now, Russell here, like I said, he was a cooker of meth, and over the last couple of years, he had slowly gained territory all throughout the Mojave and high desert. And now it was time to cash in on the high desert's need for methamphetamine. Now, Debbie's friends, they wanted to know if Debbie wanted to make a lot of money very fast, and they also assured her that she would get protection and would not get busted. And Debbie agreed. So Debbie's mindset here was like, well, you know, these people have sort of like helped me when I struggled in the past, you know, they've done me favors. And so she kind of felt like she sort of like, you know, owed them a little bit, you know what I mean? And that's why she agreed. So every week, Debbie would make the drive out of the Mojave Desert, out of 29 Palms, down to San Diego, to the reservation and retrieve the drugs. Now, I'm unclear on if Debbie was just, like, the drug runner or if she actually, like, trafficked and like, sold the drugs herself. I'm a little unclear on that. However, and this scheme, worked for some time, but like with most things like this, right, it was sort of doomed to fail from the beginning, right, So Debbie had befriended a teenage girl at the Motel 6. Remember when she was staying at the Motel 6 up in Northern California? She had made friends with a troubled teenage girl. This girl ended up on Debbie's doorstep in 29 Palms with her little toddler and no place to go. And the girl also struggled with a speed addiction. And Debbie, as we'll get into, just can't help but take in people who are struggling and stuff. So she let the girl stay with her. However, this poor girl just ended up being a lot of trouble for Debbie. One time the girl had sold an informant at half an ounce of speed. And when the cops were, approaching the house, the girl snuck out of the window, sprained her ankle in the process, and then later on called Debbie from like a parking lot somewhere asking for a ride home. The final nail in the coffin, though, was one night, right? So Debbie gets off shift at the E Club, right? And she gets home, and not long after getting home, she gets a phone call from Russell. And he had a tip. The police were coming there on their way. So Debbie immediately hangs up, grabs all of like the drugs and like her like scales and stash and stuff. So that's why I was a little unclear on if she sold it herself. But she gathered all of it up, went to a local grocery store, went behind it, and dumped all of her paraphernalia, her drugs, and all that stuff into the dumpster. And not long after getting home, the police descended on her apartment and pounded on the door, demanding to be let in. And Debbie, of course, shot back like, "Oh, do you have a warrant?" And that's when the cops broke down her door, guns drawn, and not just drawn to Debbie. There was a cop who actually put a gun to Mandy's head, and Mandy is only about 10 years old at this time. And their dog, Corky, is of course barking incessantly, like going crazy. The cops are demanding that like Debbie, calm down her mutt and stuff, and Debbie just like stands her ground and is like, "He'll calm down when you remove your weapon from my daughter." A 10-year-old. I mean, come on. It's 2022 in America that we can very, very clearly picture a cop drawing a gun onto a 10-year-old. Debbie threatened that she was going to sue them for violating her Fourth Amendment rights, and that's when the cops told her that, like, they weren't there for Debbie. They were there for her roommate, who was actually in the shower smoking speed. When the cops descended into the apartment, they dragged her out and arrested her and proceeded to tear through Debbie's apartment looking for any other speed or drugs. But all they could find was the tiny amount of speed that the girl had not yet been able to smoke. And so the cops left with the girl handcuffed. I am unclear as to what happened to her child. I can't remember if the book mentioned it or not. And Mandy, who had just had a gun pointed at her head, went into the house, took her mother's, like, I guess her mom had, like, some pipes and bongs for, like, smoking marijuana, went outside and, like, smashed them on the ground and told her mom that they did not need to give the cops another reason to come back. And Debbie agreed with this. She was like, "You know what? You're right." And so the next day, Debbie called Russell and was like, "Hey, man, sorry, but I'm out. All right, I can't do this anymore." And just a few days after she had called Russell and told her that she was out, there was a huge drug bust that swept the entire high desert, and Debbie was not a part of it. She had narrowly escaped some serious prison time. Now, after this incident, Mandy would recount it to anyone who would listen. It just kind of became that story that she told, because people wanted to hear it, like, oh my God, especially, when like you're 10, 11, 12, like growing up right through the years, becoming a teenager, like people are just like, oh my God, like tell me about the time that like the pigs drew a gun on you. You know what I mean? Like, especially when you're a teenager, right? And the whole thing is about rejecting authority and like, wanting to be like a badass and stuff. And so Mandy would recount this tale for years to come to anyone who wanted to listen to it. And of course, over the years, it also got a little bit of embellished here or there. You know how it is when you're a teen. You've got a cool story to tell. And so at this point in the story, Debbie, Mandy, Christy, and Jason had been in the desert for about 7 years. Mandy was 14. And despite that little bump a few years in, the family continued to thrive and just, live their lives. Mandy, who again was 14 years old, had very much developed into a little like miniature version of her mother. They shared the same eyes, the same personality, and the same sort of like fashion sense and style. They were both kind of like tomboyish. Mandy swam on the local swim team, and they were called the Aquatics, and apparently Debbie had swam in high school as well, so that was another thing they had in common. And Mandy also played first base. One of her most prized possessions was actually a Steve Garvey poster, and Garvey had played first base for the LA Dodgers and the San Diego Padres, and he was like Mandy's idol. She absolutely loved him, loved baseball, loved playing first base, and this poster hung on her wall and was like one of her most valued prized possessions. Mandy was an average student, loved to dance and party. Just like her mother, they loved to dance and party together. Although, whereas Debbie preferred sort of like classic rock and roll and country, Mandy loved rap and hip hop. Now, though mother and daughter were very close, there were times that, of course, the two butted heads. Sometimes this ended up being a literal fight between them, like getting physical. However, it is said that the fight would quickly resolve itself, and the two would immediately calm down and be back to normal, and the fight would be over as soon as it had begun. And despite any disagreements that, she may have had with her mother, Debbie and Mandy were very close. They were always there for each other. Debbie said that Mandy had especially always been there for her throughout the years. Apparently, when Mandy was like 8 years old, Debbie was riding like a bucking bronco at like the rodeo, and she got like thrown off, and she said 8-year-old Mandy was like right there with a Budweiser. It was just like, here, Mom, have a beer, so they had like that kind of relationship, Sometimes the two would drive out into the desert and go to a favorite place that they had among the Joshua trees. They would climb this like secret trail that they had to the top of some rocks and just, hang out and talk and, just sort of contemplate on life. And, like Debbie was very thankful for the stability that she was able to give her children. That's what she had come to 29 Palms for. She had even earned the moniker Desert Debbie. And so, yeah, they would, often come up there and go up there and, sometimes have like some, like deep bonding talks. Sometimes they would just, go up there and hang out as mother and daughter. They loved to watch the shooting stars at night. And yeah, it seemed that this place was just exactly what Debbie and her kids needed, and everyone was flourishing. At this point, Christy, who was the oldest, she was planning on enlisting into the military. Mandy would be graduating in about 3 years, because she was 14 around this time. And the youngest, Jason, was, just blossoming into a happy child, and things just really seemed on the uptick. It seemed like this was their life that they had settled into. Now, I mentioned before how Debbie, really liked to take in, for lack of a better term, like strays, both in human and animal form, and Mandy was also the same way. They both just had a lot of compassion for people from all walks of life, especially, considering what they had both gone through, Debbie in her life, and even Mandy in her short life, her childhood. So they were very open-minded, and they would always welcome their doors to, like I said, both human and animal strays, for lack of a better term. Mandy became a very frequently requested babysitter around the area. The local children would call her Aunt Mandy, and she would often, babysit, like babies, toddlers, small children. And often the mothers of these children, not all the time, but pretty often, these mothers were either Mandy's age or not that much older than 14-year-old Mandy herself. Some of these mothers were very, very young. They were wed to Marines, and their Marine husbands were stationed away. Some of these mothers struggled with, alcohol and substance abuse. Other moms would constantly rotate a ever-revolving door of men into their children's lives as they, searched for stability and stuff. And Mandy just became known for sort of like babysitting and watching these children and really having like a really special bond with them. She would often bring her rap tapes to the houses when she babysat. Like I said, she loved to dance and she loved music. She would also bring her children's books and read to them. For a lot of these children, not everyone, but for a lot of these children, these were like the first books that anyone had introduced to them that had like even been brought into the home. Now, one of the children that Mandy watched, her name was Chanel. And Chanel's mother was Rosie Ortega, who was also a friend of Mandy's. And so that was a little bit about Mandy Scott. Let's get a little bit into her friend, Rosie Ortega. Rosie Ortega. She was originally born in the Philippines, in the province of Batangas. And she was born sometime in the early 1970s. I actually could not find an exact birth date for Rosie. Rosie's mother, her name was Juanita, and she had entered into an arranged marriage at 13 years old, which was very common and as was custom for the province of which she was from. And 9 months later, Juanita had Rosie's older brother, Ray. And then she had her 2 other children, a girl named Jessalyn and the baby, Rosie. Now, Rosie's father ended up abandoning his family, and so Juanita had to go to Manila, where she found work at seamstress school. And this was so she could make money, and any money that she made, she sent back home to her children, who were actually living with Juanita's parents. And they lived in abject poverty. They lived in a 1-room shack, which was made of logs, or specifically batang. And like I said, the family was very, very poor. Now, this whole province wasn't exactly like well-to-do, but even for the area, Rosie and her family were obviously like in abject poverty, even compared to everyone else, you know? They slept on bamboo mats, had no running water or electricity, and their meals were actually cooked outside on rocks. The nearby Kalimpang River, that actually provided their water for drinking, showering, and laundry. Like, that was their primary water source. It also provided them with their primary food source, which was fish. Now, like I said, even though this whole province wasn't really well-to-do, it was very clear that Rosie and her family were, you know, the poorest. Her and her sister and brother were made fun of for, you know, their threadbare clothing, because kids are dicks no matter the era or the region. Am I right? Now, on the very, very rare occasion that they even had some spare change, Rosie and Jessalyn would spend their change on watching episodes of Happy Days. And they were able to do this because some of the more like well-to-do people in the area, they had generators which provided electricity for them. And a neighbor would let the children watch their TV from outside through an open window for like a few coin. And on the rare occasion that Jessalyn and Rosie did have some coin, they would go and watch reruns of Happy Days, and they would fantasize about what life in America would be like. Their ultimate dream was to come to America. The girls would pore over their fashion magazines and just kind of, you know, glamorize all the models, fantasize about what it would be like. Rosie even had some pictures that she had kept, and she kept them in like a little tin box, and all these were like pictures and stuff that she had cut out that would like symbolize what she thought life in America would be like. After a couple of years of working in Manila, Juanita met and married an American serviceman. He was actually a Marine, and he was a drill instructor. My lord, I can talk, I promise. He was a drill instructor. And he worked at the boot camp in Paris Island in South Carolina. Juanita, because she had been going to seamstress school and had sewn, she ended up getting a job making wedding dresses at a small shop that was located not far off base. And eventually, over the course of several months, she sent for her children one by one to come live in America with her. She did not have the money to send for all 3 of her children at once. And so, when she was 11 years old, baby Rosie was the first one to go to America. And Jessalyn and Ray followed soon after. Now, to say that living in the States was a culture shock is an understatement, all right? Like, this was a huge shock to them. And more so than that, not just the culture, the diet was even a shock to them. Remember, like, they're used to living on, like, fish and rice and stuff. And so when Rosie and her siblings came over to the States, they had to acclimate to the American diet, and they actually were sick. And, yeah, like, their tummies had to get used to it. Get used to all the poison that we have here. I'm just kidding. I love fast food, obviously. But it wasn't all bad, all right? So for one, all right, the kids were just shocked that they had a car and it had running AC. Like, what? That blew their minds. Not just that. Their house on base, each child would have their own room. And this floored them, guys. Remember, they were used to living in a 1-room, like, little shack with their grandparents, 5 people living in 1 room on bamboo mats. And now all of a sudden, they are in cars with AC. They have their own bedroom. And not just that, the house had a television, guys. Like, so many of us, growing up in this country, being born in this country, right? Like, these are just things that we end up taking for granted, right? But like, for Rosie and her siblings, guys, this was just like, oh my God, this is just like the dream. This is just like how we fantasize life in America would be like. And it was just really good for them. They were on top. They were living it up. And things did seem, pretty good. However, because we are talking about this case, nothing good can last, right? So not long after all of her children had come to the States, Juanita's husband soon began physically assaulting her and abusing her. Now, Juanita, she did stay in the marriage, and she said that she stayed for as long as she possibly could because she wanted her children to still have access to like base health care and like all the other perks that children or dependents of servicemen get, Like, isn't that sad? In 1985, after the family had been stationed in Honolulu, Hawaii, Juanita finally left her abusive husband. Ray had just graduated high school, and Jessalyn, though she had avoided her region's and culture's tradition of entering into arranged marriages at 13 years old, Jessalyn was still going to be married before she graduated high school to a Marine. And she was a junior in high school at this time. Rosie had ended up dropping out of high school in 10th grade, had traveled to Southern California and gotten involved with a serviceman. I think specifically he was with the Army. And he ended up fathering Rosie's daughter, Chanel. Now, soon after leaving her abusive husband, Juanita met the love of her life. It was a man named Tom Brown, and he was a Marine, and he ended up taking Juanita to his native state of Michigan. However, remember, Juanita's from a warmer climate, and she just could not acclimate to the freezing sub-temperatures of Michigan. And so it was decided that Juanita and Tom would move to Southern California to be close to Rosie. And on the way there, on their move there, Tom taught Juanita how to be a long-haul trucker. That's what Tom did for a living. And Juanita wanted to be able to go out on the road with her husband, and she figured like, hey, we can make more money if both of us are truckers rather than just one. And so Tom taught Juanita how to be a long-haul trucker, and then they moved to Southern California. They ended up settling in Garden Grove's Saigon section, which is like outside of LA, like in Orange County. And this is where Rosie was living. And she was no longer with Chanel's father. She was with another man, an ex-Marine. And Rosie had her 3-year-old daughter, Chanel. She was attending teller school at the San Juan Bank. And Ray followed everyone else to Southern California not long after. He had still been in Honolulu. Jessalyn, like I said, got married. And soon, her and her Marine husband were also in Southern California. He had been stationed in San Diego. He had been stationed in Long Beach, not San Diego. He was stationed in Long Beach, and Jessalyn was pregnant with their son at the time. And by 1988, Jessalyn, her son, and her husband, they moved to 29 Palms, where her husband had ended up being stationed. They lived on some off-base housing, and soon after, Juanita and Tom followed them. And a couple months later, Rosie showed up in 29 with Chanel, sans her ex-Marine boyfriend. And she stayed with Jessalyn and her family for a while. But by 1991, Rosie, she was 18 years old, and she really wanted to get a place of her own. It was very important for her to be able to try and be independent, and she ended up finding an apartment of her own. It was pretty typical, kind of like 29 Palms housing, to be honest. If you can't guess, 29 Palms is the town that I lived in for about 6 or 7 years. And so she found this kind of cheaper apartment in a more, sort of like poor, rundown area of the town. But, she enjoyed having her own apartment, like it was her own place. And she saw us living here because she found this apartment, this apartment complex. She saw it as just sort of like a temporary stopgap, She loved having her own place. It was close to her job. She was the night manager at the local Texaco / Mini Mart. And Rosie's plan was to, save up some money, get her high school degree, apply for American citizenship, and then, the world was her oyster. She could do whatever she wanted. She was very excited to start this new phase of her life. Now, Rosie quickly made friends in her new home. She was always outgoing, a little quote, too outgoing, according to Jessalyn. Rosie was just one of those people it was just very easy to make friends with. She was very extroverted, very sociable. She would always talk and chat with the customers when she was at work. And because she worked the night shift, there were, more than a few unscrupulous people, along with some Marines and kind of like your typical kind of young people who can kind of party late out into the night. But Rosie, she never judged anyone, all right? Never judged anyone. In fact, if someone came through and was like, hey, I don't have money for gas, but I really need gas, Rosie would just flip the switch and let them pump gas. And she's like, you know what? Like, get me the money when you can. You know, she was like that kind of person. Rosie started attending school, and I think that's kind of maybe where her and Mandy first met. Her and Mandy had some mutual friends, and so, yeah, things were on the upturn for Rosie. And like I said, much like with Mandy, Rosie had a very big heart. When Rosie's good friend, Arlissa, when she came to Hawaii, she was like broke and tired and just really needed a place to stay. Rosie was like, you know what? You stay with me. And she also got Arlissa a job at the Texaco. And yeah, Rosie was just kind of thriving. She was working her job, living in her little 1-bedroom apartment. But you know, she put that like lived in sort of like loving touch to it. I think kind of like that feminine touch as well, you know? She, you know, bought like curtains and tablecloths and just kind of like spruced up the place. It said her apartment always had toys everywhere because she was definitely trying to give Chanel like that, you know, quintessential American childhood, like one that she absolutely did not have. And so she loved showering her daughter with gifts. But according to Rosie, her apartment was empty unless it was filled with people. Like I said, she was very sociable, very extroverted. Like, Rosie loved to have people over, all right? And her door was never locked because she loved when people just stopped by. And to that end, because she also loved making friends, Rosie would give her address and phone number out to anyone and everyone. And as a result, her apartment constantly had an influx of all kinds of people coming in and out. And yeah, she loved having people over, all right? She loved being the hostess. She would always like cook and have her, you know, music out. She loved rap and hip hop, so she'd always have like the best like cassettes and stuff, because remember, we're in 1991, so we're in cassette tapes. And she just loved having people over. And her home quickly became just like a haven for all kinds of people. Like, she had lots of Marines who would go in and out. But there are also like a lot of young people, like a lot of like young kids who were in the Marines who were scared and like away from home for the first time. Kids and young people who had more of like a rough home life and stuff. Rosie's, again, became sort of like a refuge, like a haven for them. And like I said, Rosie was always happy to oblige her guests. She loved having people over. And much like with, you know, Mandy, she never judged anyone. Rosie would, you know, have her girlfriends over, and she'd always give them elaborate manicures. And, you know, she was always like a good shoulder for them to cry on and stuff. She started comforting and getting close to some of the other single mothers in the area. And yeah, was just described as just a very loving, caring, fun person. And of course, as we know, Mandy was also one of Rosie's friends who would come over. She would often babysit Chanel, and the two girls, yeah, developed a friendship. Now, Juanita, though, she did not exactly love her daughter's living conditions, all right? She did not exactly love it. I mean, she kind of had good reason to. Like I said, this was not in, like, the best part of, like, the town, right? Juanita, on her first day to visit her daughter at her apartment, she literally saw a speed deal go down, like, right in front of her, and she was like, what the F? She also did not like all of the Marines that her daughter would befriend. She didn't like all these Marines coming in and out of the home, being around her granddaughter. And she would voice this to Rosie. And she would even take Chanel on her truck drives, on her long-haul truck drives. She would take Chanel with her because, you know, she just did not like all these Marines around her granddaughter. Now, some of these Marines, to the credit, you know, they would, you know, bring toys and stuffed animals over for Chanel. Other ones would, like, go grocery shopping and buy, like, food and stuff for Rosie. Because, like I said, Rosie was a very sociable person, and she very much had sort of like an open community policy where, you know, it's just like, hey, like, what's mine is yours, you know? And it was very much like a community that she ended up developing, you know? But still, Juanita was still uneasy about all these Marines and military men in her daughter's life. And to be fair to Juanita, it's not like she was the only one with her eye on this complex that Rosie lived in, all right? Apparently, this complex was very popular with Marines, particularly Marines from the 311, which was an artillery unit who had served in the Gulf War. And this apartment complex had been so popular with, you know, particularly members of the 311, so much so that it was actually under surveillance by the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, The NCIS. In fact, it was quite often that you would see a couple of NCIS officers sitting across the street in a nondescript vehicle, and they would just take notes on the comings and goings of the apartment complex. So one time, right? So, you've got these NCIS officers just kind of, keeping an eye on the complex. And one time, Mandy and a bunch of friends were outside of Rosie's apartment. They were listening to like some Michael Jackson tapes and were trying to teach Chanel how to moonwalk. Not being very successful, might I add. And so, while they were, all of their dancing doing that, Rosie had actually made some lumpia, which was like some spring rolls. And she actually offered some to the officers sitting in the car. And they declined, saying that like, oh, well, we can't really know what's really in there, so we have to decline. To which I guess Rosie just sort of shot back like, oh yeah, you better watch out for home cooking. Like she was just kind of like that kind of chick, like she was just very open and honest about what she thought and stuff, Now, when the 4th of July, 1991 was fast approaching, Rosie dove into preparations for it, right? This was going to be her first big bash in her own apartment, and she started planning like months ahead of time. She wanted this big bash to just go absolutely perfectly. She wanted to celebrate being in her new country while paying homage to her roots. She spent weeks turning her apartment into Kainan Kamayan, I hope I said that right, which translates to a place where you eat with your hands. She wanted to prepare a feast that would make her grandmother proud. For weeks, she made an abundance of lumpia and stored it in the freezer. She made bagoong. I hope I said that right. Bagoong, which is like a fermented like shrimp paste. It can be made with fish as well, but it's like a meat paste because she knew that her American friends were inevitably going to bring meat to barbecue. And she also bought cases and cases of like beer and drinks and other supplies. Like I said, she had been planning this for months because this was going to be a huge blowout. Now, Rosie's friend Arlissa, she was living with Rosie at this time. And like I said, remember Rosie got Arlissa a job at the Texaco. Well, one evening in May, Arlissa was working her shift when all of a sudden a young Filipino woman came running through the parking lot, like running away from someone. Apparently there was actually quite a large, like little population of Filipino people in 29 Palms, a lot of whom had come to the States via the military. So this young woman is tearing ass across a parking lot, and there was a man chasing her, and he caught up to her and started beating the crap out of her. And a customer who was pumping gas and was witnessing all this tried to intervene, but instead the man grabbed a rock and bashed the Good Samaritan's head in, and the Good Samaritan ended up dying 2 days later at the hospital. And it was actually Arlissa's testimony that put that guy away, the woman beater and the murderer, who was a Marine, and Arlissa's testimony helped put him away for manslaughter. But after this incident, Rosie, she wanted Arlissa to move out. She felt that witnessing a murder was bad luck. Rosie was very, very superstitious, and she had her 4th of July bash coming up. And she just felt that Arlissa now had like a bunch of dark, negative energy around her because witnessing a murder is very bad luck. Very bad luck. And so she couldn't have that around her and her daughter. She actually contemplated canceling her 4th of July bash, but Arlissa ended up moving out, and she actually called a friend to come pick her up, a Marine. This Marine's name was Lance Corporal Valentine Underwood. Now, Valentine Underwood was the youngest of 7 children. His mother, Zemina, was the primary breadwinner of the family. She was a nurse. And Valentine's father, David, was described as a, quote, jack of all trades, who was also known for up and disappearing for stretches of time, sometimes at night. I think sometimes he would be gone for like days as well. Valentine and his siblings were raised in a very strict Baptist household where Bible reading was a daily activity. Zemina would often tell her children Bible stories. And Valentine's favorite was the story of Daniel and the Lion's Den, and it was said it was Zemina's favorite as well, and it is said that she would always use this story as a parable for racism in America for her children. And her kids wondered if maybe the story didn't have like some more maybe personal meaning to her as well, because the state of Zemina and David's marriage wasn't really great at all. I mean, like I said, he would sometimes like up and disappear, so yeah, I can't imagine that marriage was like the best. Finally, after 19 years of marriage, Zemina divorced David, and she took her and her children and moved them to a lower middle class suburb of Baltimore, Maryland, specifically to the suburb of Watton. Now, after high school, 4 of Valentine's siblings would actually go on to enlist in the military and thrive, and Valentine would be the 5th Underwood to enlist. So Valentine, he attended JFK High School, and he was an average student who, it is said, had a promising basketball career in front of him, all right? He was 6'6", 240 pounds, who was described as a powerful center who had the athletic skills to back up his large frame. Now, while growing up, Valentine idolized and modeled himself after Patrick Ewing, who was the then star of the Georgetown Hoyas. Later, Valentine would take his hero's number 33 as his own. In 1981, Valentine enrolled in Lubbock Christian University, and this was located in Lubbock, Texas, and he got in on a basketball scholarship. Valentine had this vision of his future, and that was of him playing professional NBA, all right? And he thought he was just going to be like a big star discovered out of college. However, what Valentine would actually become known for wasn't his athletic skills or his game. It would be his mistreatment and abuse of women. Now, many women lodged complaints with the school authorities, which, by the way, always go to legit authorities. Like, I know they have problems, but like, yeah, don't report that stuff to school authorities. But yeah, there were so many complaints lodged against Valentine by numerous women to school authorities that accused Valentine of sexually abusing them, sexually harassing them, physically abusing and harassing them, and just on and on and on. And so many had lodged so many complaints that in 1985, Valentine was asked not to return to Lubbock University for 1 semester. Yeah, a 1 semester suspension is all that scumbag got. Now, during his brief little vacation time, Valentine took this opportunity to take some ROTC courses, and he took them at Texas Tech. And in 1986, he returned to LCU, where he graduated with a degree in psychology, a 1.95 GPA, and a reputation among students, faculty, and security as a manipulative person who had a way of ingratiating himself to people, like most manipulative, charming people can be, right? And it also didn't help that Valentine was in an environment where his actions were never punished, all right? He never faced consequences for his actions. And he already had this overinflated, like, sense of ego that, like, he thought he was great and could do no wrong, and not getting in trouble for any of his despicable behavior just, added to this. Now, Valentine was disappointed that he had not been recruited to the NBA, and so he returned to the East Coast in an attempt to find a job. For a while, he worked at a Jewish home for the mentally disabled, and this was in Tacoma Park, Maryland, but it wasn't long before his old behavior presented itself once again. What a shock, right? On July 2nd, 1987, Valentine was arrested and charged with sexual assault, the R word, by the Montgomery County Police Department. Now, shortly after, though, the victim disappeared, and without, a witness or anything, the case was dropped. Valentine then spent some time in upstate New York, but not even a full year later, he was arrested once again on sexual assaults, the R word. It really bugs me that you can't say that on YouTube. It's so dumb. And he was arrested on June 6th, 1988, and this was in Binghamton. I hope I said that right. But once again, the case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. Valentine then returned to Maryland, and he did find work as a civil inspection engineer, but he didn't last there long, and he was fired in 1989. Now, at this point, all right, Valentine's prospects were not really that great. It was either like fast food and retail jobs, the military, or the streets. And so, faced with those options, Valentine chose the military. And at the age of 29 years old, Valentine enrolled in the Marines. Now, his age did not actually work against him. So at this time, the Marines was full of older recruits. A lot of these recruits had lost their factory jobs and had no other way to get support. And the heart of the Marines' advertising campaign right now, like at this point, was really focusing sort of like on the challenge of it, like, oh, do you have what it takes to live up to, the thousands who died before you in, Okinawa or Iwo Jima or, something like that, the few, the proud, the Marines. Like, this is what their advertising campaign was really boasting at the time, and it worked like a charm for the Marines. So at this point in time, it had been 15 years since the end of the draft, and the Marines were the only branch of the military to actually meet their monthly recruiting goals. That's how well this advertising campaign went for them. Now, despite Valentine's arrests for sexual assault and all that, because of course the Marines are going to know, they're going to know what your past consists of. And they were perfectly well aware of Valentine's past, but they didn't care. And so, on June 6th, 1990, Valentine became a Marine. And like many, many Marines, Valentine found himself stationed in 29 Palms. And this was relatively soon after joining, because at this point in time, things were about to blow in the Middle East. And so in a run up to what would be the Gulf War, a lot of the Marines were being stationed in 29 Palms in order to train in desert warfare. That's the whole reason anyone is even out in that part of the desert, is it makes really great training ground for Marines who have to go and be in the Middle East. And apparently desert weather and terrain and stuff is very similar. So yeah, there was a bunch of Marines stationed over there, including Valentine, who then trained in desert warfare and then were sent over to the Middle East to fight in the Gulf War, Valentine included. After the Gulf War ended, many Marines returned to 29 Palms to the sound of cheers from the residents, and they were super happy that the Marines were back. Not just because, they wanted the troops home, but because when the Marines had shipped off to war, the economy in the area completely dried up. Many struggled to get by during this time, including Debbie. She bartended at a place called the Iron Gate. She had actually bartended at various places all throughout the area. And at this point in time, she was bartending at the Iron Gate, and what little patrons that she still had more often than not tipped her in food stamps, but Debbie never used them because she was too embarrassed, even though her and her kids really could have used them, because more often than not, she had to serve mac and cheese for dinner, which just kind of made her mad and humiliated her. And it's well, bitch, if you have food stamps, then use them. We really need to get off of this cultural shaming we have of people on welfare and food stamps. I would much rather my tax dollars go to feeding someone hungry than going into anything that has to do with the military industrial complex personally. Anyway, the economy was hit not just due to the Marines shipping out, but they also shipped out at a time where the tourist season just absolutely bombed. Apparently there had been a very lackluster wildflower blooming season, and a lot of people, I don't know if you're aware, but Joshua Tree National Park is in that area, and that's where a lot of people will come and go through the park and stuff. I personally don't get it because I don't really find the desert beautiful, but I was also born and raised in it, so maybe that's why. But yeah, it had been a very lackluster tourism season as well. So the economy, the local comedy, the local economy was not doing well. And so with the Marines returning home, the end of the Gulf War, it was just a very good time in the town. Mandy, who was now 15 years old, was in the 10th grade, loved choir and gym and English, and was looking forward to her mother's tip jar being full again, because she knew how humiliated her mother, got by having to serve them mac and cheese and top ramen and stuff for dinner. Mandy had also found a close-knit group of friends. Now, in the desert, where offshoot gangs are, a thing, there are local offshoots of the Crips and Bloods and other stuff like that. That is a thing. Mandy and her friends referred to themselves as the Lunchbox Gang, and they had even made t-shirts. And Mandy did have some local affiliations with local gang members. So that was another thing that kind of fueled them wanting to kind of have their own little gang name. Mandy had blossomed into a very friendly, open-minded, kind-hearted teenager. And like I said, many of the young kids she watched just really loved and admired her. One thing that Mandy did struggle with, though, was her absentee father. All right, she was kind of struggling with it. Like, she wanted her dad to love her, In fact, on her 15th birthday, Mandy had actually sat in her room and cried and sat alone because her piece of shit father did not call his daughter on her birthday. He didn't call the next day either. It wasn't until the day after that, when Debbie called Max, that he spoke to his firstborn. And he told Mandy, oh, hey, you know what? Sorry I forgot to call you on your birthday. I was at Six Flags with my family and, quote, lost track of time. Yeah, that's what he told her. What a piece of shit. And this, of course, was just very, very crushing to Mandy. Like, she just wanted her father to want to be a part of her life, and he would rather, be garbage. Despite her father being a total trash heap, Mandy was a very go type of person. She was always out hanging out with some friends, always doing something. And as she got older and started, getting a little more sexual, Mandy ended up developing a proclivity for the black boys, all right? That was kind of her jam. And Debbie was not a big fan of this. Yeah. To call it what it is, it's racism. It's racism. Debbie would always chide Mandy and ask her why she wanted to, quote, burn coal. But Mandy would just always stand her ground and always clap back and be like, well, why does color even matter to you? You say you don't believe in, segregation, yet, why do you have a problem with me going out with black boys, And, let's be fair here, to be fair a little bit to Debbie, she was not alone in being, racist. Not that excuses it or anything, of course. But yeah, Debbie was not the only one who thought it was wrong, I guess, for interracial couples to exist. And in fact, there was still an underlying racist environment in the area that was even, playing out as the events of this case take place. Black and brown drivers were much more likely to be pulled over for going a mile or two over the speed limit, whereas white drivers would constantly speed and not get pulled over. There were still restaurants where black and brown patrons would be left waiting while white patrons would come in after them and be seated immediately. There was still that kind of culture and environment going on. All right. So for Mandy to just openly and brazenly be yeah, I like black guys, what of it? That was sort of, going against sort of the local culture at the time. Even Mandy's younger brother, Drayson, who was 13 at this time, he had fallen in with a bad crowd at school. He had fallen in with some white supremacist people, and yeah. It's not like that was a unheard of thing out there. But despite her mother and brother's racism, Mandy was just never like that. And yeah, she really liked dating black boys, and it is said that they really enjoyed her too. She was quite popular. Now, when the Marines returned home, there were of course a whole bunch of parties going all throughout the desert, one of which happened at the Iron Gate where Debbie bartended. Mandy was there with, her friends. Rosie was there as well. And Rosie was about 20 at this time. And yeah, it was just a good time. Debbie was by far the most popular local bartender. So the place was really bumping. And Chanel was actually with Juanita on a truck drive. So that's why Rosie was there sort of partying it up. And Valentine also dropped by the Iron Gate to party. However, he had actually been banned from that establishment for, just being a creep towards female patrons. And Valentine ended up causing a fight when he refused to leave, and the bouncer had to physically and forcibly remove him. And in the ensuing chaos that happened, Mandy ended up getting a black eye, and Debbie had to be the one that ended up sort of squashing everything. But Valentine, all right, he would cause even more trouble after this, all right? So a few months later, in June of 1991, Valentine sexually assaulted another girl named Tammy Watson, and she was just 17 years old. She lived in Desert Hot Springs with her 4-year-old son and roommate named Rebecca. I know, she was 17 with a 4-year-old son. I know. So sad. Now, Rebecca was actually the one who knew Valentine, and so one evening, the girls decided to drive up from Desert Hot Springs and hang out in 29 Palms with Valentine. Now, they stopped at Valentine's apartment first. Although this wasn't actually Valentine's apartment, the apartment actually belonged to a Marine named Sean, but he was hardly there. And so a lot of Marines kind of used his apartment as sort of like a local hangout or a refuge when they didn't want to go back to base. And Valentine was one of those who used it. So when the girls get there, Valentine and some Marines are smoking some marijuana, and the girls join them. And then Valentine suggested that, hey, let's all head over to Gabby's. And they were a local bar, and they were having like $1 tequila shots. And so he's like, hey, let's go there. I think Rebecca stayed behind to continue smoking some weed, but Valentine and Tammy, they ended up going to Gabby's. And they hang out, and they, get a little buzz and some tequila, and they dance. And then as they're dancing, Tammy's like, yo, can you actually drive me to base? Because there's actually like this Marine that I wanted to surprise. And coincidentally, this Marine happened to be in Valentine's unit, the 311. And so Valentine and her leave Gabby's, and he drives her on base. And as Tabby smokes a cigarette while she waits outside the barracks, Valentine disappears into the barracks, all right? So a few minutes passes, and Valentine comes back, and he's like, oh, hate to break it to you, but like, yeah, your Marine's in bed with someone else. And like, yeah, you don't need him anyway. Like, let's just go. Like, he just immediately started like bad-mouthing the Marine and not really letting Tammy get a word in edgewise. And so they left, and Tammy's like, okay. But instead of driving Tammy back to Gabby's or back to the apartment, Valentine drove Gabby out into the middle. Did I say Gabby? Because of the local bar? God damn it. Valentine drove Tammy out into the middle of the Mojave Desert and violently sexually assaulted her. He threatened to kill her if she screamed. And afterwards, when he was driving them back, she was crying, and he kept telling her to, quote, shut up, shut the fuck up. And when they got back to the apartment, Tammy was visibly upset and was missing her shoes. Apparently, when they got there, like, Valentine was yelling at her to, like, get out of the car, get the fuck out of the car. And she was, like, scrambling, trying to find her shoes because they had slipped off. And, like, when he yelled at her, she just, like, beelined it from the car into the apartment. And so, of course, like, the other Marines there's like, whoa, what was going on? She's clearly upset. And that's when Valentine told them that she was upset because they had found her boyfriend in bed with someone else. And that's why she was upset. And that's when Tammy was like, no, your friend just sexually assaulted me. And of course, she used the actual word. But yeah, she told them, like, no, your friend just sexually assaulted me. And that's when Valentine denied it. He called Tammy, quote, crazy. And that's when Tammy ran out of the apartment, ran down to the corner of the street where there was a liquor store, and phoned 911 from a payphone. She then called her friend Melissa, who lived one street over, to come get her. I am unclear on where Rebecca is at this point. If she had left with maybe some other Marine and wasn't at the apartment. I don't think Rebecca was there at this time. But Valentine and another one of the Marines from the apartment had taken off after Tammy, and they actually got to her before her friend Melissa could. And Valentine pulled up, got out of the car, and started yelling and berating poor Tammy, demanding to know who she had called and demanding to know if she had called 911 or the cops. He then dialed 911 himself and said that it was his girlfriend who had just called, and she was, quote, flipping out trying to get him in trouble and that they should just ignore her. He then hung up and told Tammy that if she told anyone what he had done, he would kill her. He and the other Marine drove off, and then a few seconds later, Melissa pulled up, and she took her friend to the hospital where they did find evidence of the sexual assault. And a few hours later, Valentine was being questioned by police. They were questioning him at his barracks, and he said, quote, the bitch tried to pick me up at Gabby's. I didn't want to fuck that fat pig. Then she started screaming about how I raped her. Yeah, that's how he talked about Tammy. And that should tell you how Valentine views women. He views them as lesser than. I know, what a pig, right? What a pig. Now, for 2 weeks, Tammy was agoraphobic. She could not leave her room. Her brother, Ricky, had to end up staying with her, and her ex-husband picked up their son because she was obviously not in a state to care for him. She did not talk to anyone, and she did not emerge from her room for 2 weeks. And finally, after 2 weeks, Tammy decided to call her father and tell him what had happened. Tammy's father was George Watson, and he was a sergeant major in the Marines and was the highest ranking black NCO in the entire Marine Corps. And he was damn proud of this fact, too. Damn proud of being in the Marines and damn proud of what he had achieved. And so I'm sure it came as a major blow when his daughter called him and said not only was she sexually assaulted, but it was a Marine who did it. Her father asked if she had gone to the police, which she had. Tammy would later tell friends that she was actually kind of fearful about telling her dad and getting the Marines involved at all. Because of the way, like, the Marine Corps and, like, their followers and the whole culture kind of view people like her, they view her as the kind of girl who, quote, asked for it. And just FYI, in case it just needs to be said, nobody asks to be assaulted. All right? Nobody ever asks to be sexually assaulted. So yeah, Tammy was afraid that she would be viewed as someone who asked for it because of, you know, she hung out the barracks, she was sexually active. I mean, she was 17 with a 4-year-old. So yeah, she was afraid that she was going to be viewed as like, oh, well, what do you expect, you know? And in fact, her father did ask her why she had to act the way that she did, why she had to do this. Didn't she realize like what kind of trouble this caused for him as a Marine and as a black officer? And she promised her dad that she would do better and she would do everything that he said, because she was traumatized, guys. She was very traumatized, and she kind of fed into a little bit of this, like, toxic culture of, like, victims asking for it. She, you know, thought, like, maybe I did ask for it, you know? Like, it was really sad. And so, yeah, she told her dad, like, yeah, Dad, I'll do better. I'll do whatever that you tell me to do, and I'll do it. And that included dropping the charges and letting him handle it. And that's exactly what Tammy did. She said that she felt comfort thinking that her father was going to make sure that Valentine paid for what he did. And she would later say that she did remember her father telling her and promising her that Valentine would be under confinement on base as the matter was being looked into and stuff. But when Sergeant Major Watson was, like, later interviewed, you know, he said that he claims that he never promised his daughter anything, all right? He never said that he would be locking up Valentine or anything like that. And he said even though he may have told his daughter that he was, like, restricted, he went into a whole bunch of technicalities of what, like, restricted actually means for an officer. There's a bunch of, like, different definitions. He then said that the assault of his daughter, though terrible, it was a private matter. All right? It was a private family matter, and it wasn't to be discussed with strangers. And he even applied that, yeah, it was his daughter's own fault as to why what happened to her happened. Yeah, can you believe that? What a piece of shit. What a piece of shit. And I feel like I don't have to tell you, but I will just to clarify, nothing was ever done to Valentine for his assault on Tammy. Now, another month later, it was July 1991, so July 4th, Rosie had her huge bash. And yeah, it was a huge rager, a huge smash. Everyone brought lots of food and games, and just a lot of fun was had by all. Mandy brought her trademark snack, which were M&Ms. So ever since her father had forgotten her birthday, her 15th birthday, Mandy had gone around and said that her last name wasn't Scott, it was McMasters, which was her mother's last name. And she would actually sign all of her notes and stuff with her initials, MM. Hence why, you know, M&M sort of became her trademark and kind of became important to her. Like, she was really wanting to kind of get over her father, you know? Which is just so sad, dude. That's his firstborn child. Later that night, Rosie, Mandy, and a bunch of other girls had played blackjack and, you know, just kind of talked and hung out. Mandy was wondering if her ex-boyfriend, Kevin Bone James, would want to get back with her after he got out of jail, but that was probably unlikely because he had knocked up someone else, so things weren't looking great, and she was kind of bummed out about that. Rosie was also bummed. She was wondering if her Marine boyfriend, Lance Corporal Timothy Carmichael, who was also with the 311, she was wondering if he was going to forgive her for sleeping with one of his friends. He had been stationed away, and again, Rosie's a very social type of person. She doesn't do well on her own, and she was lonely, and she ended up sleeping with one of Timothy's friends. And so he was pretty peeved about that. And she was wondering, like, oh, will he forgive me? Will we get back together? Many girls ended up spending the night at Rosie's apartment, including Mandy, who ended up staying all the next day as well so that she could watch Chanel while Rosie went to work. Valentine, he had spent his 4th of July getting aggressive and creepy with women, who of course rejected him because he's a creep, and he ended up getting into a fist and knife fight with a bunch of men who had grown offended on the women's behalf. He had also spent time at Rosie's 4th of July bash as well. But when he got into like that knife fight, that was like away from Rosie's party. Now remember, at this point in time, Tammy thinks Valentine is restricted to the base, actually restricted to his barracks. But in fact, nothing was done to him. Although, okay, I guess that wasn't fair. Valentine had been assigned, quote, chasers, which I guess are just Marines who kind of like keep an eye on other Marines. Now, it is alleged one of the reasons that Valentine got such special treatment was because what a valuable basketball player he was to the 29 Palms Marine Base basketball team. Yeah. He was, again, a power forward and regarded one of the best players in the league, and he scored an average of 45 points a game. Now, not long after the 4th of July bash, plans soon started revolving around Mandy's upcoming 16th birthday, which is a big deal, the Sweet 16. Debbie, all right, she was especially excited and stoked for her daughter's birthday because, all right, the tips had been so good. All right, she had saved up so well that she was able to buy Mandy a sky blue Ford Camaro. Yeah, bought her daughter a car for her 16th birthday, and she was super, super excited to give it to her. She was hoping Mandy would use it to, get out of here and go live her life, because she knew her daughter was bigger than that area, and that she knew that her daughter had lots of dreams and stuff that she wanted to do. And so, yeah, she got her a car hoping that this would be the first step in making those dreams come true. I don't think it was a year. It was a 1980 sky blue Camaro. I wasn't sure if I said the year or not. I don't think I did. Now, Debbie had planned to present it to her daughter on the morning of her birthday, and she had already told like a bunch of like friends and family friends about like her plans. Like, she was super excited. Mandy's friend Tina, her birthday was 2 days after Mandy's, and she was also going to be 16. And so the girls were planning a like joint birthday celebration. And so Tina was also looking forward to the upcoming celebrations. However, due to her breakup with Bone and the remembrance of her father forgetting her last birthday, it seemed the only one who wasn't really looking forward to her birthday was Mandy herself. She was hanging out with Rosie more and more, who was also despondent and lonely because of what was going on with Timothy. They had been back in contact, but so far it was like just over the phone. They hadn't like physically seen each other. On July 31st, Juanita and Tom stopped by Rosie's apartment to pick up Chanel. They were going on another truck drive, and they were taking Chanel as was custom. And Chanel said goodbye to her mother and her, quote, Aunt Mandy. And this would actually be the last time that Chanel would see her mother or Mandy. And with her birthday just a couple of days away, on August 1st, Mandy stayed over at Rosie's. Rosie was, she was lonely, wanted someone to hang out with, and Mandy thought, maybe hanging out with someone would just kind of help her forget that her birthday was upcoming, that her dad was a scumbag, Now, the two girls, they watched TV until sundown. They listened to some music and just kind of hung out, and around 11:30 p.m., they walked a few blocks down to the Texaco. Rosie had been promoted to general manager of the Texaco, and she wanted to check in on the girl who was doing the night shift. Now, on the way there, Rosie thought she saw a friend of hers driving in his truck, and she flagged him down. But it turned out it was just someone else driving her friend's truck. It was a Marine, and his name was Trent Draper. He offered the ladies a ride to the Texaco, and they agreed, and then he drove them back to Rosie's apartment where they hung out, had some drinks, and played some cards. It should be noted that Mandy did not drink. She did not drink or do drugs. She was very straight edge. So it was Rosie and Trent who were drinking, while Mandy was just sipping on some soda. And then after playing some cards, they walked back down to the store to stock up on some supplies. I think because Rosie and Trent had been drinking, I think that's why he couldn't drive them. And so they walked down to the grocery store, and while there, Mandy runs into her mother, Debbie, and her longtime boyfriend of 5 years, Mike. And they talk. Mike gives Mandy some money to, buy some groceries and stuff. And then they part ways, and Mandy, Rosie, and Trent head back to Rosie's apartment. Now, at Rosie's apartment, the three continue to play cards. Trent and Rosie keep drinking while Mandy's just sipping on her Dr. Pepper. And now at some point, Valentine and another friend of his named Carl, they stopped by. And Valentine immediately starts getting creepy with Mandy, who she was just not in the mood. All right, she was not in the mood for any guy to be hitting on her, but especially Valentine. He's very creepy, and she kind of told him off and pretty much told him that she was not down. She was not down to clown. She was not down with his BS. And so they finally leave. And then after that, a revolving door of Marines and people came in and out of Rosie's apartment, as was custom. And then after a while, Rosie's neighbors who lived down the street, they stopped by Rosie's apartment. They were called the Samoans because they were three very friendly, outgoing Samoan guys who, like I said, lived down the street. They were named Tony, John B., and Kaipo. And, they were there hanging out. They took some of Rosie's meat and then walked back down the street to cook it at their apartment. Like I said, it was a very sort of like community-based sort of social circle that Rosie had instilled there, And Mandy, wanting to get out of the house and kind of sick of all the Marines coming in and out, she decided to walk down the street and hang out with Tony, John, and Kaipo. But the three guys, they were too drunk to cook up the meat, so Mandy actually cooked it up for them and hung out with them for a little while. All the while, Tony was dropping hints on how much, he liked Mandy. He kind of wanted to get with her. But again, she just was not in the mood. Mandy then left their apartment and walked back down the street to Rosie's. And when Mandy gets to Rosie's, Trent is still there. He's pretty drunk. And Rosie, who is also pretty inebriated, is trying to drunk dial Timothy. Apparently, Timothy was assigned to the rifle range at the moment. And so, he was not available. And so she was, drunk and crying and trying to get a hold of him. But Mandy stepped in and got her off the phone and coaxed her to the couch. And Rosie ended up passing out from just sadness and too much to drink. Meanwhile, Mandy and Trent kept hanging out. And eventually, after one thing led to another, Trent gave Mandy a massage. And then Mandy performed oral sex on Trent. And then the two ended up having really bad, really mediocre drunk sex. And that was right before Trent promptly threw up all over Rosie's kitchen from drinking way too much. Yeah. And then he promptly passed out, which, left Mandy was just like, oh my God. So she cleaned up the mess and then left. And she left to go back to Tony, John, and Kaipo's apartment, the Samoan guy's apartment. And like I said, Trent ended up passing out on Rosie's floor while Rosie passed out on her couch. And Trent ended up leaving Rosie's apartment at about 7:30, 7:45 the next morning, where he went to West Covina to hang out with some friends. Now, Valentine's night. Let's get into Valentine's night and what he did after he left Rosie's apartment, after he had creeped on Mandy. So he stopped by a local dive bar called the Club Max. Unclear as to when he separated from Carl. And he went to the Club Max hoping to get lucky, all right? He was looking to get laid, all right? So Valentine said hello to the Samoan woman who was the sort of bouncer at the door. She greeted all the guests, and she really liked Valentine because he always asked her how she was doing, always said hi to her, and would sometimes bring her pizza from the local pizza joint Rocky's. Now, once inside, Valentine struck up a conversation with two women. A woman named Julie Shute, who was there with her Marine boyfriend named John, and Deborah Ashworth, who was Julie's friend and had a history of troubled, abusive relationships. Yeah, and now she's meeting Valentine, I know. Now, after closing time, Valentine, Julie, John, and Deborah, they all get some more booze at the store and then head back to Julie and John's apartment where they lived and where Deborah was staying. And they end up hanging out some more. And after a while, Julie and John went to bed, leaving Valentine and Deborah alone in the living room. And after losing at a game of quarters, Valentine tried to get a kiss from Deborah, all right? He tried getting a kiss, and she wasn't having it. She was like, no. And, he tried again, and again, she said no. And that's when Valentine violently shoved her against the counter, grabbed a butter knife that he saw on the counter behind her, and held it to her throat. He said, quote, "I know why you asked me here." Now, Deborah, thankfully, managed to push him off, and then she sprinted down the hall and pounded on Julie and John's door, demanding that they kick him out and whatnot. Julie emerged from the door and from the bedroom and closed the door behind her. And, Deborah was like, "You need to get this crazy psycho out of here. He just tried to kill me," and this, that, and the other. And of course, Valentine denied everything. And somehow, Julie was able to diffuse the situation, was able to calm everyone down. And so Julie then left and went back to the bedroom, leaving Valentine and Deborah once again alone in the living room. And the two did end up sleeping in the living room, not together. I believe Valentine crashed on the sofa, and then I think Deborah slept on the love couch or something like that. But yeah, kind of weird. I was like, what? But remember, this Deborah chick, all right, she had a history of abusive relationships, all right? When that's all you know, your whole view is sort of distorted, you know? She started thinking oh, well, maybe I did ask for it and stuff. It's just really sad stuff. Now, John's alarm, it went off at about 5:30 a.m. because he was a Marine, and when he got up to leave, Valentine was also up, and he asked, hey man, can I catch a ride to base? Because, I gotta do formation. Deborah also woke up when John and Valentine were on their way out, and she asked to tag along. I know. And so they go to base. Deborah goes to Valentine's barracks, and he tells her to wait in his barracks while he goes to formation, and that he'll drive her home when he's done. And after only waiting about 20 minutes, Deborah decides to leave, and she hitches a ride back to Julie's apartment. I know. I don't understand those chain of events either. Valentine later showed back up at Julie's with another fellow Marine and some rum. They wanted to party and hang out some more. Now, Valentine's friend and Deborah went to the store for something, while Valentine stayed behind at Julie's apartment and smoked some crack cocaine. And he smoked it on her front porch, and when his friend got back with Deborah, he and his friend left. Now, too drunk and high to return to base, Valentine had his friend drop him off in front of a liquor store. And when he's in front of the liquor store, he goes to a payphone and calls a cab. But he doesn't even wait for this cab. He instead hitches a ride with a couple who had gone into the store, a couple named Rajan Lord and Faye Potts, and he hitched a ride with them to the ATM. They were going there as well, and he was like, oh, I need to withdraw some money. Can I hitch a ride? And so they do. They all withdraw some money, and then he asked them to drop him off at a friend's house that was right around the corner because he was still looking to party, all right? He was still looking to party from last night, and so Rajan and Faye, they do. Who were these friends that Valentine wanted to be dropped off at? Well, it was John, Tony, and Kaipo, the Samoan guys. Yeah. And so Rajan and Faye drove Valentine over to their apartment. Now, of course, it's early in the morning and people are, just going down from partying and sleeping it off. Valentine knocked on the door and was like, hey man, I'm looking to party. And of course, the guys were like, dude, nobody's partying here. It's way too early. We're all sleeping off last night. Nah, ain't nothing here. And at the Simone guy's apartment, Mandy was actually there. She had actually slept with Tony that night. Not sexually slept with, physically slept in the same bed as him. They had made out a little bit, but that was about it. She had just, actually stayed the night over there. And when Valentine had come busting in, it woke her up. And so Valentine left after being told that there's no party here, man. And then Mandy, being woken up, was like, you know what? I should go check on Rosie because I kind of left her just passed out on her couch and I'm going to go check on her. And after not finding any partying inside, Valentine went back out to Rajan and Faye and was like, hey man, thanks for the ride, but I'm good from here. And so they leave him, and Valentine just starts wandering aimlessly, down the road. And he was thinking, man, where do I go? And he's like, oh, you know what? There's always a party at Rosie's place. Let me go to Rosie's place. There's always something happening there. And so that's where he headed. Now, I'm not sure how, but Mandy got to Rosie's first, and when she got there, Rosie was already up and getting ready for work. She had the radio going and the swamp cooler going, and they greeted each other, and she was, just like, oh, hey, how was last night? Oh, we're fine, just kind of exchanging pleasantries. And then Mandy was like, hey man, it's tired. I'm gonna go pass out in your room because I'm super tired. And Rosie's like, yeah, go for it. And Rosie hopped in the shower to continue getting ready. Now, under the sound of the swamp cooler and the radio, Valentine's entrance into Rosie's apartment went unheard. Police theorize that upon entering Rosie's home, Valentine shut the blinds, turned down the radio, unbuttoned his shirt, removed it and his shorts, took off his shoes, then his socks, and stuffed each of his socks inside of his loafers. He laid out his clothes across the back of a chair, went into Rosie's kitchen and got one of her 11-inch kitchen knives. And he entered the bedroom where not yet 16-year-old Mandy was just dozing off in Rosie's bed. She was wearing her bikini top and shorts. And because she wasn't yet fully asleep, she stirred when Valentine entered the room. You know that feeling you get when you're not alone? That was the feeling that Mandy got. And so she woke up, saw Valentine in her room, and sprinted for the door to get out of there. But unfortunately, Valentine easily stopped her. He tied her hands behind her back, and he used the electrical cord of a lamp. I read another report that said that he used the telephone cord. But either way, he tied her hands behind her back, pushed her down on the floor, pushed her bikini top up around her neck, tore off her shorts and underwear, and violently sexually assaulted Mandy. And as Mandy let out a painful scream, that is when Valentine lifted the knife and sliced Mandy's throat, cutting her scream short. And as he is sexually assaulting her, he sliced her larynx, almost to the spine, by the way, and he kept stabbing her over and over. He slashed at her pelvis and her buttocks, but mainly focused his rage and his attack on her breasts. He also assaulted her from behind and maniacally and ferociously stabbed Mandy over and over and over, as he's sexually assaulting her as well, to make it even worse. He stabbed her over and over, going through her ribs and cartilage. There was damage done to her lungs, heart, and diaphragm. One knife wound went so deep it penetrated her chest cavity and went into her back about 8 inches. One of the stab wounds was literally only stopped from going deeper by bone. This was a brutal, vicious, violent attack, guys. Valentine ended up stabbing Mandy 33 times, and she died within minutes of the attack. After he had brutalized and murdered Mandy, Valentine got up and went to the bathroom where Rosie, completely unaware of what had just transpired in her bedroom, was taking a shower. Now, police theorized that Rosie was still in the shower when Valentine entered the bathroom, sliced through the pink shower curtain, grabbed Rosie, and hauled her onto the bathroom tile. And then he violently and viciously sexually assaulted Rosie from behind, right next to the toilet. And as she fought for her life, Valentine brought down the knife. And just like he had done with Mandy, he began viciously and quickly stabbing Rosie. He slashed her all over, but like with Mandy, mainly focused his stabbing and aggression on Rosie's breasts. And Rosie did put up a fight. She had gaping, terrible defensive wounds all over her hands and arms. And though her throat slashes weren't as deep as Mandy's, the wounds to her abdomen certainly were. Because remember, Valentine started his attack from behind with Rosie. Stab wounds had penetrated Rosie's liver and its blood vessels. She had stab wounds on her back that had actually gone through her abdomen to her kidneys. And like with Mandy, Valentine stabbed Rosie 33 times. He then went over to the bedroom after he heard an air bubble escaping from Mandy's throat. And this actually freaked him out for a quick second because he thought that Mandy wasn't dead yet. And when he bent down to check her pulse, he did confirm that she was dead. And I think that air bubble scared him and frightened him. And so he backed against the wall and he ended up leaving a bloody handprint behind. He wiped the knife off with a rag, stepped over Rosie's body that lay in the entranceway of the bathroom in the hallway, and proceeded to take a shower and clean himself up. He then walked into the living room and got dressed. He ended up getting 6 wounds to his left hand, and the clock on the wall said it was around 10 o'clock in the morning. And prosecutors theorized that this attack happened between 9:45 and 10 a.m., and the date was August 2nd, 1991. Now, get this, all right? So at this time, where Valentine is cleaning up after the murders, Debbie pulls up outside of Rosie's apartment in Mandy's birthday present. Debbie had decided that she just could not wait to give her daughter her birthday present. So she's like, you know what? I'm just going to give her her birthday present early. And she knew she was at Rosie's. So she pulled up in the sky blue Camaro. And Valentine, of course, heard her. This isn't a very big apartment, So Valentine heard her, freaked out, went into the bedroom with Mandy's body, shut the door, and crouched down beside Mandy's body, clutching the knife. Debbie knocked, and then she opened the door a crack to peek inside, and she saw the remnants of last night's partying, and she saw the bedroom door closed. I don't believe that she could see the bathroom from the doorway. I believe that was further down the hall. So all she could see was the shut bedroom door, and yeah, she saw like the ashtrays and like beer cans and cards, and she's like, oh, well, they probably like, hung out and partied last night, and the bedroom door's closed, and she's like, what, I'm gonna let my daughter sleep. I'm just gonna let her sleep, and I'll give her her present later on today when I see her. And so, without knowing just how close she came to the same fate as her daughter, Debbie left Rosie's apartment. After being satisfied that the coast was clear, Valentine wiped the knife once again, dropped it on the floor, and left the bedroom. Stepping on the knife with his loafer, went through all the trouble of wiping it down, and the idiot steps on it. Which, is actually pretty good that murderers aren't exactly all that clever, right? Valentine then left Rosie's apartment and dropped a bloodied washcloth in a trash can next to Rosie's washer and dryer that were outside. Now, not long out, and he just started like walking, all right? And now, not long after, Valentine was spotted walking by an on-again, off-again girlfriend. Her name was Alonda Anderson, and she saw him walking and gave him a ride to base. She dropped Valentine off in front of his barracks, and when he asked her if she could drive him to his basketball game, it was being held at the Norton Air Force Base. She said, no, I can't, I'm busy. Valentine had missed his ride with his coach. His coach had left at 9 that morning, and he was too busy, plotting to murder and being drunk and high wandering through the streets. And so he had missed the ride with his coach. But Valentine would end up getting a ride to the basketball game with a fellow Marine named Billy Dunlap, and they left at around 1:30. Valentine ended up at the basketball game, but ended up not even finishing it because the injuries to his left hand were throbbing and were preventing him from playing. And so he had to bow early to get his hand examined. He had lacerated tendons in his left hand and was given a cast. And then later that evening, Valentine called an old flame who lived in that area, and they got together. And the next evening, he met up with his teammates and coach for dinner. Now, meanwhile, back at Rosie's apartment, approximately 8 hours after Valentine had left it, at around 7:40 p.m., Rosie's would-be boyfriend, Timothy Carmichael, he pulled up with his friend William outside of her apartment. Timothy was off the rifle range now, and as he was gone, he had time to, contemplate and reflect, and he decided, you know what? He loved Rosie, and in fact, he didn't care about her affair with his friend, that he wanted to be with her, and in fact, he wanted to marry her. And he immediately opened Rosie's apartment, of course, with nothing but reconciliation on his mind. And when he opened her apartment, there was static on the radio, and, the lights were off, and there wasn't, really anyone seemingly around. He's like, okay, that's weird. He called out, but no one answered. And he then went into the bedroom where he saw Mandy's naked, mutilated body. Now remember, because it's, dark and stuff, at first, Timothy doesn't really, register what he's looking at, you know what I mean? He was looking at this girl on the floor, and he's like, why does she have no clothes on? And, why are there holes in her chest? You know what I mean? And, as he's, sitting there looking, trying to figure out, he sort of, looks over and notices Rosie's body in the hallway and the bathroom. Rosie's head was lying in the hallway on the carpet, and her feet were splayed across the bathroom floor. Timothy went outside, got William. William took a look outside and was like, no, dude, this was an ambush. We need to call the cops and call them now. And so they did. Now, Debbie, meanwhile, she had been trying to get a hold of her daughter all day. And around 8 p.m., Debbie pulled up outside of Rosie's apartment where police were finishing off taping off the crime scene. Debbie, of course, had no idea what happened, but she tore through the crime scene and was making a beeline for Rosie's door when a paramedic who knew Debbie actually stopped her and informed her that her daughter was in fact dead. And of course, Debbie went into shock, as anyone would. Now, Detective Norm Parent and their pair of criminalists, they entered Rosie's apartment to collect forensics. They discovered the bloodied handprint on the wall, blood-stained tissue on the floor, a black sock with a stain that was logged as, quote, white and crusty. I know. numerous bloodstains, a blood drop on a magazine, and a swath of forensic evidence was, of course, swabbed and taken from Mandy and Rosie's bodies. In fact, Rosie's apartment was so small, right? So small that in order to properly examine Rosie's body and not destroy any evidence, the forensics team actually had to work out of a closet that was luckily located like right across the hall from the bathroom. And they actually had to back up and work out of that small closet to properly examine Rosie's body that laid across the bathroom in the hallway. All in all, it took them 6 hours to gather all of the evidence from Rosie's apartment. And at 1 a.m. on August 4th, on what would have been Mandy's 16th birthday, both Mandy and Rosie's bodies were taken. Rosie would have been 21 years old in about a month. Debbie was still there when her daughter and Rosie were taken from the apartment, and because she was a witness due to stopping by earlier that day, investigators informed her that she could not ride along with her daughter's body. I'm not sure why. 4 days later, Debbie was allowed to claim her daughter's body, and 2 weeks after that, Debbie picked up her daughter's ashes. She took the ashes to their secret spot where she smoked a joint and just kind of mourned her daughter. Like, I can't imagine. I can't imagine as a parent having your child die before you. Like, how awful. Rosie's sister Jesselyn was able to gather enough funds to actually fly Rosie's body back to her native Philippines, where she was laid to rest in the family plot. Now, the usual suspects were, of course, questioned immediately after the murders, all right? The Samoan neighbors and friends, remember Tony, John, and Kaipo, they were, of course, questioned. And Tony actually roused suspicion on a polygraph test because it showed investigators that he was being deceptive and not fully truthful. And that's when Tony admitted that, like, he and Mandy had actually made out that night. That's where, like, some hickey marks that were found on Mandy's body, he said that those were from him, that they had, just kind of, like, made out a little that night. But he had a girlfriend, and he didn't want his girlfriend to find out, and so that's why he was being deceptive. Marines, because that was kind of like the known sort of type of people that Rosie hung out with, they were all questioned, of course. As were people who Mandy knew. Remember, Mandy did know people who were in these gang offshoots up in the desert. They were questioned as well. And the local rumor going around town was that the whole thing was a drug deal that had gone bad. And this was further exacerbated when Debbie's former ties to the Hells Angels and, like, kind of her rough background, when that came to light, people were wondering, like, ooh, like, were they killed as, like, sort of like a message to Debbie that, like, you don't leave this life? You know what I mean? Meanwhile, as investigators were working the case, they pondered the significance of the number 33. Because remember, both Mandy and Rosie were each stabbed 33 times, which was just so random and odd to investigators. It stuck out to everyone. But it wasn't until military investigator David Hertberg was assigned to the case that the big break would come, all right? So Hertberg was a basketball player, and he had been on the 29 Palms Park and Rec League team, all right? And he had actually been on the team with Valentine. He was in awe of Valentine's talent. Remember, like, Valentine is a tall, domineering looking man, and he had, like, the athletic skill to back it up. So he was pretty memorable to anyone who played with him, right? So Hertberg, he definitely remembered Valentine. He knew that Valentine was a huge fan of Patrick Ewing, knew how much he loved wearing the number 33. And after Hertberg found out that Valentine had been placed at Rosie's apartment the night before she was murdered, learned how many times each victim was stabbed, and knew the significance of 33 to Valentine, this all started getting the gears turning in Hertberg's head. And he was like, you know what? We need to question this guy. And so he alerted military investigators at Balboa Naval Base in San Diego, where Valentine was. He warned these military investigators to keep Valentine on lockdown until authorities could get there to question him. Valentine had been sent to this naval base to get treatment for his hand. A pair of military investigators handed Valentine over to members of the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. Now, no one would answer him when Valentine demanded to know what this was all about. He said, quote, "Hey, what is this shit? This has something to do with that bitch say I her, because I straightened that shit out." Yeah, nice, right? Now, in the interrogation room, still not being told what this was all about, detectives questioned Valentine about the injuries to his hand. He said that he'd been banging up his hand the last few weeks. He claimed that he injured his left hand playing basketball on a backboard, that he had cut it on a backboard or something. And he said that he had also cut his hand on a razor blade. And this was when he was scrubbing out a trash can on field day. Apparently this is a day where Marines have to like clean their barracks and living area from like top to bottom, like every corner. And he said that he was cleaning the trash cans on this day and he cut his hands on a razor blade that was in the trash can. He said that it was like one of those Bic, like disposable razor blades, and someone had peeled back the plastic to expose the razor blade and left it in there. And when he went and reached his hand in there to clean the trash can, he cut it open. He also claimed that this was done on Thursday, August 1st, but he didn't get treatment until early Saturday, August 3rd. And later on in court, Lance Corporal Robert Wendell, who shared a bathroom with Valentine on base, he disputed Valentine's claims of cutting his hand. He said that he himself had actually changed out the trash cans, and at no point in that day did Valentine come up to him complaining that he had sliced open his hand. Now, when detectives questioned Valentine about his past brushes with the law and his past, problems with women, Valentine blamed it all on racism and, quote, bitches. Yeah, it was all a misunderstanding. The authorities were racist against him and always took, quote, bitches' side. And that, all these women were just lying about him. Yeah, those were his excuses for all of his past brushes with the law. Now, it should be noted, throughout his whole interrogation, Valentine asked for a lawyer 54 times, and each time he was ignored. It was actually the worst case of Miranda rights violation in the history of San Bernardino County. In fact, this interrogation was so bad and so unprofessional that the most incriminating parts of it were inadmissible in court. In these parts that were never heard by the jury, Valentine denies ever having met Mandy or Rosie. He had no idea who they were. He denied ever being at Rosie's apartment until finally he admits to being in the apartment and admits that it is his blood and semen at the crime scene. Now, not long after Mandy's murder, her older sister Christy had a really difficult time. She suffered from insomnia and nightmares. And she struggled with this so badly, it actually caused her to lose 20 pounds in only like a month or two, and this actually led to her rejection from the military. After moving back in with Debbie and being nursed back to health by her mom, Christy met and fell in love with a Marine named Chad Yerke, and he would end up being her future husband. The two struck up a relationship, and it lasted through Chad's deployment. He had been deployed to Somalia, and the relationship survived that. And when he got back, the two would often double date with Chad's roommate and his girlfriend, who was a woman named Tammy Watson. Remember Tammy? Now, one night, right, the four were eating dinner together, and Tammy, who did know who Christy was, she had heard of the murders of Mandy and Rosie, and she knew who Christy was, and she finally confessed to her about who she was and her connection to Valentine. And it was actually Christy who encouraged Tammy to actually come out with her story and take it public. But Tammy was reluctant because at this point in time, her dad was like just nearing retirement, and she was really scared about like causing any waves for him, Christy ended up telling her mother about who Tammy was and what had happened to her. And that's when Debbie started to look into the option of suing the federal government for her daughter's death. And her argument was that the Marines were aware of Valentine's past behavior and yet did nothing to rein him in or do anything. He actually sexually assaulted the daughter of a Marine Corps officer and nothing was done. But no lawyer would touch Debbie's case because it all hinged on Tammy's word. It was so difficult, if not impossible, to prove, Finally, after much flaking out, Tammy finally did agree to meet with Debbie, and they did agree to meet, and they talked. And afterwards, Debbie, that is when Debbie filed the paperwork to sue the federal government herself. She was like, if no lawyer wants to help me, I'll just do it myself. And so she filed the paperwork that was basically stating on public record that she was planning on suing the federal government. And she specifically blamed the Marine Corps for her daughter's death. Now, this is a small town, right? This is a small Marine town. And so word quickly spread around town. And of course, there were a lot of people who were peeved off about this, all right? There's a lot of, I call them bootlickers, frankly. That's probably not fair, but there's a lot of people who have ties to the Marines, whether through family or they themselves, or there are people who are just staunchly advocates for the military for some reason. They're like just all about it. That's what that whole culture out out there was about. So of course, they get word that someone wants to sue the federal government because they blamed the Marines for the murder of their daughter. Yeah, word's gonna get around. And of course, who do you think had to bear the brunt of a lot of people's anger? Yeah, little Jason, who was still in high school at this point, and he was bullied hard. He was physically beaten up. He was ostracized. He was like the town pariah. And it got so bad that Debbie had to actually take him out of public school and send him to go live with friends in Bullhead City. In the end, Debbie's lawsuit was ultimately thrown out on procedural grounds. Now, 2 years after Mandy's death, Valentine was still awaiting trial, and Debbie, she decided to start the Mandy Scott Scholarship Fund. It would raise $1,000 to help an average 29 Palms student get out of the area. The criteria was had to be for someone who had a C average and was kind of the typical representation of the young populace of 29 Palms, was a representative of the community that Mandy and Rosie came from, that they associated with, that they themselves, had come from. Debbie really wanted to help someone truly struggling, The applicants were to write an anonymous letter describing on what they would do with the $1,000 and how they would use it to get out of the town and better their lives. Debbie threw a huge party, purple in theme, because purple was Mandy's ultimate favorite color, and all of Mandy's friends brought food and stuff. It was a huge success. The ultimate winner was a girl who wanted to get out of 29 Palms so that she could go and become a juvenile probation officer and then come back to the town and help kids who were in her socioeconomic status and from her neighborhood and stuff. So let's get back to Valentine. Don't you worry, I have not forgotten about this scumbag. So, 6 years after the murders, 6 years, in December of 1997, after going through 5 judges, dozens of delays, and 3 changes of venue, Valentine Underwood was finally brought to trial. And his trial would only last 2 months. It took this long to get here, but his trial would only last 2 months. His case took so long to get to this point that it was actually the longest running untried case in San Bernardino County history. And why was it delayed? Why did it take so long? For every reason under the sun that you can think of that could delay a trial, it happened. And this included a judge retiring, the county running out of money at some point, and Valentine changing defense attorneys. Every single one of these just caused delay upon delay. After Valentine dropped his first attorney, his second attorney, Garrett Zellin, he filed motion after motion, case after case, citing this, that, and the other, trying to get, this evidence thrown out, that evidence thrown out, this, that, and the other. Pretty much what you want a defense attorney to do. But each time he filed these motions, that just caused delay upon delay upon delay. And he was going all out, dude, right? He tried to say that the blood that they had collected was tainted because a forensic investigator had stored the blood in his fridge, and that fridge had beer in it. Yeah, I know. I mean, he was trying, man. He was clearly trying. So yeah, after years of causing delays through his motions, finally in 1996, Zellin filed a motion to be dismissed from the case. And get this, all right? So obviously when an attorney wants to get out of a case, it's like a public ordeal, right? They got to file the petition and petition the court in open court as to why they should be dismissed from this case, right? Well, get this. When that, hearing happened, Valentine was not aware that Zellin was trying to get out of the case. He found out at that court hearing, and he was so pissed that Valentine, shackled and in his prison jumpsuit, tried to lunge at Zellin, and he had to be hauled away by 2 bailiffs. Yeah. And of course, Zellin's request was granted. And what's really funny is in all of the years of all of the motions that Zellin filed, causing delay after delay, year after year, the only motion that Zellin ever won was to be dismissed from the case. So now, Valentine got to his third defense attorney, John Hardy, who requested and was granted a year postponement while he got caught up on Valentine's case and tried another case at the same time. And throughout his years of incarceration, Valentine would lament to family and friends and anyone who would listen to him that he was receiving racist treatment by the guards, and also receiving racist threats from white inmates. He ended up becoming engaged to a woman named Christine Wilson while he was behind bars awaiting trial. And she, like many of these loons who seek out convicts, specifically like murderers, would lament and shout to anyone who would listen that Valentine was innocent, all right? And that he was, quote, just a big old teddy bear, all right? Christine and Valentine ended up not getting married. They did end up breaking up. Now, during the trial, which was prosecuted by Gary Bailey and presided over by Judge Rufus T. Yent, Hardy, he tried to throw reasonable doubt by questioning if the stab wounds had been committed by more than one person. But Dr. Frank Patrick Sheridan, he was a forensic pathologist and actually chief medical examiner for San Bernardino County. He disputed that. He did not agree. He testified that though the stab wounds were vicious, this was not a frenzied attack. All right. The stab wounds would have been more clustered together in one area if that was the case. According to Dr. Sheridan, this was a violent, quick attack with an intent to kill. Hardy also tried to get Dr. Sheridan to ponder if maybe he miscounted the number of wounds, to which, the doctor was like, no, there's no way. That's why it sticks out to me, and that's why I remember it, because I thought, well, that's weird. 33 is an odd number to just, to stab someone, and both victims were stabbed the same amount of time. So like, nah, you're barking up the wrong tree there. Now, at one point, Valentine took the stand in his own defense, and he repeated what he had told investigators in that now barred interrogation tape. That yes, it was his blood and semen at the crime scene. However, guys, he has a perfectly reasonable explanation for this, all right? Valentine said that he did in fact stop at the Club Max that night before the murders. He then went to visit the Samoan neighbors, Tony, John, and Kaipo, all right? But on the way there, he ran into Rosie. And Rosie invited him over, and he said that he had known Rosie for a few months and that she was cool and chill. And so he went over to her apartment with her. He then claims that he performed oral sex on Rosie, and he actually said, quote, "It was nothing cheap. It was respectful." Yeah, he actually said that on stand, guys. A while later, he said that Mandy arrived and Rosie left, and then Mandy pulled down his pants and he and Mandy had consensual sex. He then left the apartment, and hours later, after partying some more at Club Max, he went back to Rosie's apartment at around sunup. He claimed that the door to her apartment was cracked open, that the radio was staticky. He said that he called out for Rosie, but there was no answer. He walked in, discovered the women's bodies, checked to see if they were alive, like bent over to check to see if they were alive. And as he bent over, Mandy, an air bubble escaped from her throat, which scared him and freaked him out, caused him to jump against the wall and leave his handprint on the wall. And that impact had also torn open pre-existing wounds on his left hand, and that's why his blood was on the wall. He said that he then left the apartment and didn't tell anyone. And why didn't Valentine tell anyone? Because when a white woman is murdered and found by a black man, he's immediately to blame. That's what Valentine was trying to claim. That he had discovered the bodies first, but he didn't turn them in because, well, he was a black man and he didn't want to be the one to find two white women's bodies. Yeah, can you believe that? Like, that's a real issue, systemic issue that happens to so many innocent black men and women. How dare this piece of shit scumbag assaulter, how dare he use real life issues to cover up his crime? What a scumbag. In fact, Hardy, Valentine's lawyer, in his closing statement, I want to read to you exactly part of his statement when he was doing his closing arguments. Remember, when you're a lawyer, you're trying to get the jury to side with you, That's what your opening and closing arguments are, right? In his closing arguments, Valentine's lawyer, Hardy, said, quote, "Mr. Underwood fled because he is black. He knew that if he reported the murders, he would be blamed for them." Yeah, gross, right? It gets worse. Oh, it gets worse, all right? So another tactic that Hardy was trying to use was to, of course, put the victims on trial. He portrayed Mandy and Rosie as, quote, sluts. He really exaggerated and put their sexual activity and their sexual lives on trial. He painted them as girls who would sleep with anyone. And in his closing statement, all right, his closing statement was that part that I read to you. Here was another part of his closing statement. He said, quote, "Why would anyone have to rape these girls when the evidence has shown that they were giving it away?" Yeah. You thought that first part was bad? No. Yeah, They were giving it away. A professional lawyer in his closing argument for his client, who was the defendant, like literally said that. Can you imagine? Dude, if I was sitting on that jury, I would immediately be like, no, that's guilty. That's gross. That is so gross. And, if we're going to put people's past sexual experiences on trial here, Johnny, how about we start with your piece of shit defendant who has to actually assault women to get any because he's a loser. Hardy also tried to excuse away Valentine's semen. His semen was found in both girls' vaginas and anuses. And he was trying to say that, no, that's because Valentine had sex with them hours before they were killed, not mere seconds or minutes. Because, quote, what man can perform 4 times in an hour? Hardy also tried to point the finger at Trent, who is a shorter guy. He's like 5'7". And they tried to point the finger at Trent saying like, well, Trent is a shorter guy. And they're notorious for not being able to perform or being like suffering performance anxiety. And they claimed that after Mandy left him after their mediocre sex, he was lying in wait for Mandy when she came back and had killed her. And then he killed Rosie because she was a witness. Yeah, that's what the defense was trying to claim. Finally, after 7 days of deliberation, on December 19th, 1997, the jury reached a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Valentine's sentencing wouldn't happen until the next year on March 6th, 1998. And he was given 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. He was 37 years old. He was initially sent to Tehachapi State Prison, but after only a few months there, an attempt was made on his life. So he was transferred to Corcoran State Prison. But we're not quite done with Valentine just yet, guys. I told you this was a long one. I told you. I've got a little tail end for you. So in 2009, Andover police over in Andover, Massachusetts, they submitted a kit that had been taken from a past sexual assault that they had, all right? This crime had occurred on May 19th, 1988, and in that crime, a 24-year-old nurse whose name was withheld from public documents to protect her identity, this 24-year-old nurse, all right? She was driving in Andover, Massachusetts, all right? She was driving when all of a sudden she was run off the road. She was then punched in the face and forced to get into a red pickup truck under knife point. And for hours, she was sexually and physically assaulted. Finally, after driving over state lines to New Hampshire, she was stabbed so deep it actually perforated her liver. Her attacker attempted to slice her throat, but the knife had broken off when they stabbed her in the liver. So her attacker threw her from the truck and drove off. And he had left her to die in a watery ditch off the Interstate 95 in Hampton, New Hampshire. Now, thankfully, the woman miraculously survived because people happened to stop by and they took her to a hospital. And so when police ran her kit through the system in 2009, yeah, crime happened in 88. They were just now running it through in 2009. Valentine's DNA popped. In 2011, he was charged with the attack and flown to Massachusetts to stand trial. In May of 2014, after a week-long trial where Valentine represented himself, he was found guilty. And he was found guilty of aggravated sexual assault and armed kidnapping with sexual assault. He was sentenced to 30 to 40 years in prison, which, of course, he would serve out after his California prison term was done. And he was also to face charges in New Hampshire, because remember, he had crossed state lines, so he had 2 states to face charges in. And in New Hampshire, he was facing charges for attempted murder, second-degree assault, kidnapping, and 2 counts of aggravated assault. And I am unclear as to when, if ever, New Hampshire will prosecute Valentine. I tried to find an update on this, and I couldn't find any. So I don't know if he ever was brought to charges over in New Hampshire. I'm not sure. The victim, the nurse, she continued to have a career in nursing, and she ended up having 3 children and later divorced. Now, Chanel, Rosie's daughter, she ended up living with Juanita and Tom in Las Vegas, where she was doing well in school. She played violin, got good grades. Not sure what she's doing now, how she grew up. I hope she, is living her life the best that she can, despite her mom not being there. Debbie ended up moving out of 29 Palms and moved to Chicago with her long-term boyfriend Mike, who she ended up marrying. Jason soon followed. And Christy and her husband, they ended up living in Coal Valley in Illinois. However, they did end up divorcing at some point, and Christy got remarried and ended up having 2 children, and she became a veterinary assistant. Oh, and one of her kids, she actually named Amanda Lee after her sister. And it should be noted that the Marine Corps has never once reached out to Mandy or Rosie's family, never once apologized, never once acknowledged their role in this. They have always remained silent about it. Typical, right? To this day, Valentine maintains his innocence and even has internet access behind bars. He even has his own website, and he even has like a Twitter account, but he has 0 followers and not following anyone either. And the latest tweet was, I think, a retweet of the story of him getting convicted in 2014 in Massachusetts. So yeah. And yeah, guys, we are finally at the end. That was the tale of Mandy Scott and Rosie Ortega. And like I said, I read a book about this case. It's actually called 29 Palms, A True Story of Murder, Marines, and the Mojave. It's by Deanne Stillman. And she actually likes the desert, all right? And so she came up there and like visited, and she heard people talking about Mandy and Rosie, but of course, people didn't know their names. They just knew that 2 chicks got stabbed. And so Deanne, through years and years of research and hard work, wrote this book. She goes into vast detail in both Rosie and Mandy's families and stuff. And yeah, like I said, I lived in 29 Palms for about 6 or 7 years. I was just very appalled and shocked, but not really surprised at this crime. There were a lot of people angry at Deanne for this book because of the way that she paints the Marine Corps and the entire town of 29 Palms and the culture. And I hate to break it to you, as someone who lived in the area for about 6 or 7 years, Deanne is right on point with her accuracy and description of the culture and the type of people that are out in 29 Palms and that whole area. She is right on point when talking about the just straight up fangirling that there is about the Marine Corps over there, and they were pissed that she wrote this book. And kind of like with James Byrd, there were more people more upset at Deanne's description of 29 Palms and the Marine Corps than they were that 2 young girls got murdered. Yeah, of course, right? Of course. Because an inanimate, unsentient town deserves more respect and pearl clutching than 2 human beings, right? Like, as someone who lived in 29 Palms for 6 or 7 years, Stillman is way nicer about this area than I would be. All right, that's all I'll say about that. But yeah, totally recommend this book. My one big critique is Deanne does a lot of jumping around in this book, and it made it kind of frustrating and annoying to read about. But the story is really, really good. And wow, that was a very long one. I obviously don't have this in the editing booth. I don't know if this will turn out being longer than last week's video for the McStay family. Let me know what you think about this case. Like I said, sorry there wasn't a lot of like photos or anything. I just found this book, and like I said, this was not a well-known story, guys. This happened in the middle of nowhere to what society deems nobodies, right? And so this case is just not that well known, and I just really, really, really wanted to talk about it. And I will finally let y'all go. I'm sure you're tired of hearing me talk. I'm tired of hearing me talk. So yeah, I will end this month with this super long case. Please let me know what you think of it. And I will be back here next month. Our first video, again, is a pretty meaty one. It's a pretty long one. Probably won't be as long as this one, but it's gonna be pretty long. And then to end the month of July next month, I'm gonna have a 2-parter for you to end the month with. Yeah. So we'll get all into that next month. And until we meet again next week for Crime Dive, I hope you take care of yourself, stay safe out there. Remember, don't be a dick, just don't be a D-bag, all right? Don't be an a-hole. Just be a decent person, all right? Just seriously, just do it, all right? All right, guys, I will see you next week. Have a wonderful day, and thanks for hanging out with me. Bye-bye.